Hi class, this is Professor King. I wanted to go over the Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 lab with you in preparation for studying for your exam. As you recall, the Chapter 1, Chapter 2 lab was macro enabled, meaning it had a macro in it. You remember the buttons that we pushed to unhide the tabs. Something that I wanted to expose you all to very early in the semester as we progress. We're going to learn how to write these macros and how to edit these macros and make sure that we understand the basic logic steps that go into coding a macro and how they can be used. So I wanted to start us off on the right foot, having seen a little bit of what a macro can do. Macros can do a lot of things. They're very useful for repeated actions, and we'll get more into that as the semester progresses. But I wanted to go ahead and expose this early. I bring that up because I've just opened the Chapter 1, Chapter 2 lab file, and the first dialog box that I get here again, this is my Mac version of Excel that I do my recordings in. I often teach from a PC on Wednesday lectures, so I wanted to make sure that I do the lab files here on my Mac. So all that to say, if I want to open a workbook containing macros, do I want to disable the macros before opening the file? I want to enable the macros because that's what's going to let me work in this sheet. If you're on a Windows computer, you'll have a bar here that says enable content or enable macros. You must click on that bar and enable them before these two buttons will work. Now, there are two buttons in this file. One says, let's get started, show me the worksheets, and the other says, start over, delete and hide the worksheets. Just a word of caution, I know I have told you to have your files on autosave for this class. If you have your files on autosave when they are macro enabled, just remember there is no way to undo a macro. So when we're working in these macro enabled workbooks, I would recommend that you turn your autosave off because anytime you run a macro, there is no undo for it. So I just want to go ahead and point that out. The first button in this macro says, let's get started, show me the worksheets. So we'll click on this, let's get started, show me the worksheets, and it doesn't really do anything that we notice right off except that it unhides these two sheets that are down here at the bottom. I'm going to push the start over button so you can see when you start out, there are no worksheets down here except for home. And then when you click the let's get started button, the chapter 1, chapter 2 worksheets appear at the bottom. This being our first lab, it's really rather simple. It's based on formulas and functions and the difference between formulas and functions. So we'll talk about that as we progress through as well. I also want to point out there are some of you in class who are still having trouble opening macro-enabled workbooks. I've advised you, those of you that have told me, to update your Office 365. Hopefully you've done that, but going forward, if you can't open a macro-enabled workbook, you're going to run into some real problems in this class, so go ahead and take care of that. Let's get started on Chapter 1 tips, and let's remember what we were doing. This worksheet starts us off by giving directions that tells us what we want to be able to accomplish with this worksheet in general. And it says Savannah wants to be able to track the tips she makes each night she serves. She also wants to be able to tell how much she's paying the bartender and assistants in tip out, as well as her net tips, how much she makes. It says please format this worksheet in a way that shows percentages and dollars in the correct formats. So let's take a look at what information we have. You'll notice we have a title here, a date. We can change this date to be any variety of functions. So far we've learned today and now. So if we wanted to update this worksheet to say today, we could just enter this function equals today, and remember that this function today doesn't have any arguments. You'll notice when I just type the opening parentheses, I get today, open close parentheses. Tells me today is a function with no arguments. If I want to change that to just be today, I can do that by simply typing in that formula. For now, we'll leave it Thursday, March 1st, because this is the information from her tips from Thursday, March 1st, but know that we could change that and have it available. Again, I've told you this several times, but I'll remind you here, if you have a today function, it's going to update every time you open the workbook, every time you force it to update, or anytime you print the workbook. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and make some of these rows bigger so that I can see all of the different words that I can find in all of these columns. So what I'm doing now is double clicking on the line in between the column names, so in between E and F. And what it does is take the longest text and make this an auto fit so that I can see total received. I will tell you, if you come over here and you click on B, it's going to make that really, really wide, because you'll notice down here the notes are in column B. So we're not really going to want to do that for column B, but it does help us to be able to see what's over here. I want to point out the way these worksheets are set up is you have instructions to tell you what you're trying to get to. You might have any number of notes on a worksheet that tell you important information. So here we can see Savannah's customer subtotal and tips. So her customers ordered this amount in food, this amount in drinks, and they left this amount of tip. So the total received here in the tip rates box. So let's go ahead and realize that we have some input boxes and we have some boxes that will auto-populate based on our input. For this particular worksheet, I'm going to turn my input boxes blue, and you'll notice here I have made the total received, the bartender, the assistant drink, and the assistant food, assistant drink. These are all going to be input boxes based on the notes down here. Now, in other workbooks that we might come up with, these might change, and we might have input boxes over to the side that would say bartender, assistant food, assistant drink, and we'd be able to change the tip outs here. It's unlikely in Savannah's restaurant world that those change very often, so we'll just leave these as input boxes. And then these amounts over here will flow through based on the amounts in these boxes. So let's get started. The total received means in this tip rate box, if we're trying to calculate tip rates, we have to base it on the total tip that was received, and the total tip that is received is right there in column D. So we'll put an equal sign and put this formula equals D7. So the formula means that we're just referencing cells and performing mathematical equations between them. A function is something that I name, like sum or average or min or max or today that we talked about. But a formula just references cells. To get this to fill all the way down, and we could continue to type equals and go to the cell to the left. We could continue to do that as we work our way down this worksheet. We could click this fill handle, this green box, click it and drag it down. Or we could simply double click on this fill handle. The reason that double clicking on the fill handle works is because there is a row of data just to the left of what we're trying to fill down. Now, if we didn't have data there, for example, if we were trying to type over here and there was no data directly to the left, double clicking on the fill handle won't work. It only works if there's data directly to the left. Remember, Excel is a computer program, so it reads from left to right and from top to bottom, and so it can't do anything else. It can only look to its left. Now, we're going to say that we're going to set up how much the bartender receives based on this tip. So the bartender, in this particular case, gets 13% based off the total drink order. So the bartender gets 13%, 0.13, 13%. And we're going to just go ahead and we're going to change that to a percentage. I type 0.13, that's the mathematical equation for 13%, but I want that to be in a percentage. So I go up on the ribbon in the Home tab in the center here in this fonts and group and click on the percentage button. Now I'm going to drag 13% all the way down, and you'll notice I get 13% just all the way down. I don't have to change it. If, for example, I wanted this to go 13, 14, 15, 16, I could click on this Fill Series button and change it to go a variety of ways. So this is adding 1 to each one. So what that's doing instead of 13% is now becoming 1.13, 2.13. That's not what I want. I just want 13%. So again, I can just tell it to go down that way. The server assistant food, gets 1.75% of the food. So again, it's 0.0175 to make that 1.75%. Now, when I click the percentage button this time, you'll notice I get 2%. And you know that I just typed in the formula for 1.75%. So what's happened here is not that this value is 2, as you can see right here in the formula bar. It isn't 2, it is 1.75. This is just the format that Excel has chosen to show it to me in. So I can increase the number of decimal places showing by clicking on this increase decimal button and get back to 1.75. And again, I can double click and make that go all the way down because there's data to the left-hand side. The server assistant also gets 2% of the drink order, so 0.02. We'll do the same thing here. We'll make this a percentage, and we will copy it all the way down. Now, we don't need to increase the decimal places, but we can if you want to see them just the same as the 1.75, but that one truly is 2%. So this takes care of our inputs. Again, there's several different ways we could set this workbook up so that it would capture data in a different input box, but for this is okay. This is basically what we want for our server. So now we're trying to figure out the tip amounts, and here's where we're going to do some more formulas. So the bartender receives 13% of the total drink order for each customer. So here's how this works. The bartender receives 13%, so equals 13% times the total drinks. And you can see that the total drinks is a subtotal for the customers. The drinks are in column C. So here we have F7 times C7. The reason that we have F7 times C7 is because we want to know this for customer 1. So we don't want to click down here in any of the rows. We want to make sure that we stay on the same row, on row 7. We want to make sure that we stay. Always grab this 13% for bartender, always grabbing the drink total. This amount for the bartender, we can copy down all the way down, and I'm just going to randomly pick one and double click on it to show you. If I double click on row 15, I stay in row 15 all the way across. That's because we didn't absolute reference this. These are relative references. We also want these to be formatted in dollars, so I can simply click on the I, highlight the whole column, and hit dollars. I could also just grab and highlight these particular amounts and hit the dollar sign as well. I know I've pointed this out several times, but if you don't have a mouse for this class, I highly recommend that you get one because this is just so much easier to work in Excel with a mouse. So now for the assistant. We have to figure out what the assistant gets. Well, we're going to work with order of operations here. We're going to take what the assistant gets based on the food total and what the assistant gets based on the drink total. So we have two separate computations that need to be added together. So here, we're going to do two sets of parentheses, and we're going to say the assistant gets 1.75% times the food total, and close the parentheses, and then we'll say plus the assistant also gets 2% of any drinks that were sold. So here you can see in our formula bar we have G7 times B7, so we have assistant food times the food subtotal, plus H7, which is the 2%, times C7, which is the subtotal for the drink. So that makes sense. That tells us the grand total of what the assistant would get. Now we'll format these as dollars as well. And then we're going to come over here and try to figure out what Savannah's net tip is. So Savannah's net tip is going to be equal to the total tip received minus whatever she has to give the bartender minus whatever she has to give the assistant. So hopefully that makes sense to you. She's going to get a total of $6 left on the table. Part of that's for the bartender, part of it's for the server assistant. And so the rest of what is left is hers. So we can see that Savannah for this one is going to get $4.38. That's her net tip for the day. A way that you can check your answer is by knowing that these over here are dollars, and knowing that in total she received a $6 tip. You can highlight the amounts that were tipped out plus Savannah's tip, and again go down here to the status bar and you can see the sum right here is $6. $6 should match $6. Click down here in row 25 to make sure that our formulas worked all the way down, and they do. Lastly, something that might be useful to Savannah is what we call a function. So we can calculate a sum or add up all of her tips for the day. So we're going to take the sum of all of these tips, and in functions, we're using a function that's built into Excel. So something that will calculate for us. Sum just adds everything together. We're going to learn a lot of them as we go through. But maybe we want to bold this total, and maybe we want to give it a top and a double bottom border. to make it a true accounting total and see that Savannah on her lunch shift on Thursday, March 1st, made $183.65. So going forward, as Savannah takes into account this worksheet, she can just delete out these input cells here, and everything else is going to calculate based on whatever is input for her customer. So she can add rows by going over here and right-clicking and saying insert a row. She can add rows, she can delete rows, she can do whatever it is that she needs to do, and day by day be able to calculate her tips. So this shows one of the beautiful things that we can do in Excel. The next page in this workbook in this lab is the payment, our first payment function. So this one says, use the worksheet to calculate the down payment and monthly payment on car options you're considering purchasing. Please include today's date in the date box, one that will update each time the worksheet opens. In the viability column, use an if statement to determine if you can afford the car based on your budget. Note that your budget could change in the future. Please display the text test drive if you can afford the car. If you can't afford the car, please show out of price range. So we're going to take these steps one at a time, realizing that payment worksheets are going to be really important in this class. They're going to be really important in this class because they're really important in life. It's really important that you're able to figure out, can I afford this car? Can I afford this monthly payment? Can I afford this mortgage? Those things are really important. They're really big life skills, and Excel does an excellent job helping us figure those out. So this is why we run across payments so often. Let's get started with the first thing. It says, please include today's date in the date box. So we simply do today equals today, and it spits out 9/15, which is what day it is right now. We can also do a function called now. So if I do function called now, it still spits out today's date, but I can change my date format by coming up here and clicking the drop-down box, and maybe I want a date that shows the time as well. So if I wanted to know exactly what time it is right now, 7:17 p.m., and I could get the date and the time by using the now function. The workbook just asks for the date, so I'm going to go back to my today function. But as I have this formatted, you'll notice that today spits out midnight. Today spits out midnight because that's the beginning of the day, and the today function doesn't tell Excel what time it is. So if I'm going to choose this one, I'm going to need to choose a date format that doesn't have a time associated with it, otherwise it's not going to make sense. Next, we need to calculate the down payment. Here, we're just going to use a formula, meaning we're going to use mathematical equations and sales references. And we're going to say that the cost of the car times the down payment percentage. So we're going to put a down payment, it's in our input box, of 5%. So I want to capture 5% of the cost of the car in the down payment. So I can push enter, and we realize that 5% of 20,000 is 1,000, and we'll just be real happy with ourselves, and we'll copy that down. Now, what I recommend as you go through these workbooks is stop and ask yourself, does that make sense? Because if you stop and ask yourself, does that make sense, you're going to trip up right here when the down payment of $40,000 is not $20 million. That's not 5% of $20 million. That's not how that works. So what I recommend is that you double click on that cell, and then you'll see that you're referencing the 40,000, but where you thought that you were referencing the down payment, we'll realize we had a relative reference. So as we pulled down the worksheet, the relative reference cells pulled down with us as well, which is what we wanted over here, but we didn't want over here. We wanted to stay captured on that 5%. So knowing what we know now, we will go back and we will absolute reference that down payment cell in that top box. I absolute referenced mine on my computer by hitting Command T. Yours could be F4 or function F4 or Command T depending on your machine. Or you can just simply type the dollar signs. It's completely up to you. I just like shortcuts. Then we'll copy down and realize this is reasonable. I can double click here and make sure I have 40,000 and 5%, and I'm good to go. The next thing that we have to calculate is the monthly payment. The monthly payment function is PMT. Calculates a payment based on these particular arguments. The first argument is rate. And rate in this particular worksheet is given to us in APR. APR being an annual percentage rate. So we have 3.25%. We're going to absolute reference that because we just learned a second ago that as I drag that down, I don't want it to move. I want it to stick right there in my input box. Anytime I have something that is referenced up here in my input box, I'm going to absolute reference it. I want it to stay there. So for now, we'll absolute reference that. And we're going to have to divide that rate by 12. We have to divide that rate by 12 because it is an annual percentage rate. And we're trying to get monthly payments. So we have to be in the same time reference. You'll notice monthly payments, annual percentage rate, so we're going to have to figure something out there. The next argument in our payment function is MPER, number of periods. So here we have 5 periods, and again, since it's in our inputs, we will absolute reference it. 5 periods times 12 years. So I'll absolute reference that as well. Could you type 60 months? Sure you could. Could you type 5 times 12? Sure. Could you type D6 times 12? Sure. But again, the goal of Excel is to be able to change these things and not have to redo any of your work. So you want to hard key things as little as possible. We'll do a comma here to change our argument, and our next argument is present value. Present value of a loan, no matter what kind of loan that you have, present value of the loan is what you still owe on the loan. So here, for this particular cost of the car in row 12, the cost of the car was $20,000 minus our down payment. So the cost of the car minus the down payment is what we still owe, or the present value of our loan. You'll notice that I didn't absolute reference either one of those, because if I absolute reference them, when I drag them down this Excel spreadsheet, they're not going to move. If they don't move, then it doesn't make any sense for me to keep dragging them down. I'll just continually reference that $20,000 car with a $1,000 down payment, which is not what I want to do. The last two arguments here you'll see are fair value and type, and fair value and type are optional arguments in the payment function. We won't do them in this class. We will assume they're both default, assume they're both 0. When you get to finance and accounting, you likely will do this payment function again with those arguments, but for now, we will leave them alone and let them settle at that. So we'll notice now that we have a $343 payment, except that that $343 payment is negative. That's because Excel is telling us that we owe money. So we don't want to see it as a negative because we're comparing it to a positive budget, and that just doesn't make any sense. So we want to see it as a positive number. The way that you make that happen is you put a negative sign or a minus sign out in front of your payment function. Please put it in front of your payment function. I know that you can make it work other places in that formula, but I don't advise it, as it will not work when you get to present value or future value formulas. So stick with the negative sign out front. And we'll copy that all the way down, and we'll see our payments get larger as our cost gets larger, which makes sense. So we're going to double click on one at random and make sure we're related to the right cost of car, right down payment, and that our APR years and payments per year have frozen, and they have, so this is correct. Our last column here is viability. Our instructions we'll go back to says, in the viability column, use an if statement to determine if you can afford the car based on your budget. Note that your budget could change in the future. Note that your budget could change in the future tells you that you need to reference this $500 budget column. It is an input, and it needs to be referenced accordingly. Because my budget might be $500 today, but if my salary doubles, my budget likely is going to get bigger. Please display the text test drive if you can afford the car. If you can't afford it, please show out of price range. So we have two options. Either we can afford the car or we can't. So we have two options. We have an if statement. We're only going to type the word if one time. We're going to type the word if, the number of options that we have minus 1. So here we will type it once. So we'll start with equals if. As you'll find that when you're writing an if statement, if you can say it out loud and talk about what you're trying to get to, saying it out loud or writing it down will increasingly help you as you try to type in the formulas for Excel. So here I would say if my budget is more than the monthly payment, I can afford the car, right? So if my budget, again, absolute reference because it's in the inputs column, if my budget is greater than or equal to my monthly payment, if that's true, then I want the text returned test drive. I want to tell myself I can test drive this car. It is text, so we have to remember to put it in quotations. If we don't, Excel's going to get really mad and try to create it as a number. So we want it to be text. We've got to put it in quotation marks. If we were trying to display a number or do math with the answer, we do not put it in quotation marks. We'll run into that in future labs, but for now we're okay. If that's false, so if my budget is not greater than or equal to my monthly payment, I want this to say out of price range. So I don't get my hopes set on something I can't afford. I'll just go ahead and tell myself I can't afford it. Let's see. It says, we found a typo in your formula and tried to correct it. Do I want to accept this correction? Guys, when you get this pop-up box, I recommend that you read it because all this is trying to do is add extra parentheses. I don't want to accept its correction. I'm going to fix it myself. I have one too many parentheses, not one too few, so it's trying to break it on me. Now, as we drag this down, you can realize that once our budget is exceeded, we get out of price range. So that's great. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. And double click and make sure it's comparing the right things. Now, watch as I change my budget in my input range, right? Watch as I change my percentage rate. Watch as I increase my down payment percentage, but my interest rate goes up to 6%. This is the reason that we're trying to do input cells and then calculate things accordingly. So I'm going to go back to my defaults. Here we go. And have that captured. Now I'm going to highlight this and I'm going to put an outside border around it. Again, that's not necessary, but it just makes things look cleaner. When you copy cells down, this bottom border will disappear and it'll stress some of you out. So that's how you do it. You go up here to this border situation, select outside border or more borders or however you want to do it. Hopefully you found this to be helpful. I would love for you to continue to practice again as you prepare for the exam. Let me know if you have questions.